Inside the cold walls of Fremantle Prison, Joe was shackled and confronted with a system designed to break men. The echo of his chains mirrored the rhythm of his thoughts, calculating, observing, planning. Guards taunted, prisoners sneered, and the air hung heavy with despair. Yet Joe remained calm, his mind sharper than ever. He realized the prison itself could be read like a map. Every routine, every creak in the floorboards, every weak latch became a puzzle waiting for a solution. Punishment came swiftly, solitary confinement, labor in harsh conditions, and isolation from the outside world. But Joe learned from it all. The brutal methods of the wardens sharpened his instincts, turning fear into a tool rather than a shackle. He whispered plans to himself at night, imagining escape routes, noting patterns, and exploiting tiny inconsistencies. Each punishment was not a setback, but a lesson. Each moment of suffering a blueprint for freedom. And the legend grew. Guards began to fear his calm defiance, whispering to each other about the man who smiled even as iron bit into his wrists. Moondyne Joe was no longer merely a convict. He was a problem the colony could not solve, a spirit that could not be chained. Joe's resolve became a weapon. While other prisoners succumbed to despair, he learned to manipulate the small freedoms granted by the guards. He memorized keys, observed guard rotations, and understood human behavior better than those who tried to control him. Even minor privileges, a brief moment outside, a forgotten tool, became instruments of opportunity in his mind. He shared subtle tricks with other prisoners, testing loyalty, gauging intelligence, and turning moments of camaraderie into strategic advantage. Every whisper, every look, every unnoticed gesture became part of his plan. Joe's reputation spread inside the walls. Some called him mad, others brilliant, but all acknowledged a cunning unlike any they had seen. The warden grew wary, ordering stricter routines and double patrols. Yet Joe adapted, laughing quietly in the shadows. Solitude became his ally, observation his weapon, patience his armor. He calculated each move, each risk, until the day came when the prison itself seemed to bend to his understanding. The colony outside remained unaware that the man they deemed defeated had already plotted his next audacious move. Joe's will was unbreakable, a testament to a mind that refused to accept the impossible. The night was thick with tension, moonlight spilling through barred windows and casting silver shadows across cold stone. Joe had waited, watched, and prepared. Every detail, the guard's route, the clanging of chains, the slight looseness of a window latch was known, memorized, and timed to perfection. With silent precision, he made his move. Each step echoed only in his mind, each breath a prayer of control. Locks fell to improvised tools, doors swung with ghostly ease, and the corridors that had once trapped him now guided him to freedom. Outside, the wilderness waited like a hungry partner, dangerous yet liberating. The adrenaline surged as he leaped into the bush, the scent of freedom sharp in his lungs. Pursuers followed, but Joe anticipated every move, blending into shadows, vanishing into the wild. His escape was flawless, yet it carried the weight of legend. The colony would speak of it for years. A man untouchable, a shadow defying every chain, every law. This escape was not just physical, it was symbolic. It proved that intellect, courage, and patience could outmaneuver brute force and authority. Moondyne Joe had not only escaped prison walls, he had escaped the expectation that any man could be fully contained. The whispers began. Immediately, stories of a figure moving like a ghost through the forests, a man untamed, unstoppable, unforgettable. And so the legend of Moondyne Joe grew, inspiring fear in authorities and fascination in ordinary folk. He had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of cunning, resilience, and the eternal human desire for freedom. Moondyne Joe's name spread like wildfire through Western Australia. Villagers whispered about a man who could slip past guards as if he were part of the wind, a shadow that laughed at chains and prison walls. Children dared each other to follow the forest paths he once crossed, and the elders told tales of a man untouchable, clever beyond measure. He became more than an escapee. He became a symbol of defiance. Farmers secretly aided him, leaving food or supplies in hidden places, knowing the authorities would punish them if caught. Joe never stole from the helpless. His cunning was aimed at survival and the thrill of outsmarting the system. Each narrow escape increased the legend, each sighting adding layers of mystery and fascination. The authorities panicked. Patrols intensified, trackers combed the forests, and bounties grew higher. But Joe was always one step ahead. He understood the land, the people, and the patterns of those who hunted him. Even under pressure, he maintained a calm, calculated demeanor, proving that his mind was as unbreakable as his spirit. Through his escapades, he inspired hope for the oppressed and admiration from the public. His story became folklore, a living tale that blurred the line between man and myth. Moondyne Joe was no longer merely a convict. He was a legend moving through the wild, untamed, and untouchable. Even legends meet their reckoning. After years of evasion, Joe was cornered by a massive search party. Authorities used every resource: trackers, informants, and relentless patrols. The tension was palpable as Joe, ever cunning, tried to slip through their nets. Every forest path, every cave, every hidden stream was familiar to him, but the hunters were relentless. When capture finally came, it was dramatic yet almost anticlimactic. Joe, weary but unbowed, surrendered with the calm confidence that had defined his life. The guards who had tracked him for months were stunned by his composure. A man who had laughed in the face of every trap now standing before them with quiet dignity. Inside Fremantle prison once more, Joe faced punishment, isolation, and harsh labor. Yet even in confinement, his legend continued to grow. Fellow prisoners whispered tales of his cunning. Guards marveled at his intelligence, and the colony outside buzzed with rumors of the man who could not truly be contained. Though his freedom was curtailed, his spirit remained unbroken. The final capture did not diminish his reputation. Instead, it solidified him as a figure larger than life, a symbol of the eternal struggle between authority and ingenuity, confinement and freedom. Moondyne Joe's story transcended his own time. Newspapers chronicled his daring escapes, the audacity of his maneuvers, and the mystery surrounding his persona. In towns and villages, his name became synonymous with cunning, cleverness, and the human desire to defy oppression. The penal system itself was affected. Authorities studied his methods, altered routines, and heightened security measures. But even these changes could not erase the memory of his ingenuity. Joe's life became a lesson in intelligence, patience, and the audacity to challenge the impossible. Over time, Joe became folklore. Artists, storytellers, and later historians retold his escapes in books, illustrations, and plays. Every retelling added layers, some fact, some embellishment, but all celebrated the man who had outwitted the system repeatedly. He became a cultural icon, the embodiment of rebellion and the cleverness of the human mind. Even decades later, Australians spoke of Moondyne Joe with awe, using his story to illustrate courage, wit, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom. His legend endured not just as a man but as an idea, a shadow that reminded authorities that ingenuity can never be fully chained. In the final chapter of his tale, Moondyne Joe steps out of history into legend. His escapes, his cunning, his indomitable spirit, these were more than events. They became symbols of defiance. The forests and rivers of Western Australia seemed to remember him, whispering of his presence long after he had vanished from view. Legends say he grew older in secrecy, never captured again, always watching, always free. Stories persisted of a man who appeared when injustice was at its peak, a shadowy figure reminding the authorities that human will could never be fully restrained. His legacy became timeless. Schools, towns, and festivals commemorated him. The Bushranger was immortalized in art, books, and folklore. His escapes were studied not only for daring but for intelligence, patience, and strategy. Joe's life became a blueprint for the human desire to remain free against overwhelming odds. Even today, Australians whisper of Moondyne Joe when speaking of cleverness, rebellion, and courage. A man who slipped past chains, outwitted men, and vanished into legend, a symbol that the spirit cannot be caged. Moondyne Joe's story is more than history. It is a lesson in audacity, ingenuity, and resilience. A man, a shadow, a legend who escaped not just prison but time itself, leaving behind tales that will echo forever. The ship rocked violently against the endless gray waves, carrying a cargo of men condemned by justice or misfortune. Among them was Joseph Johns, later known as Moondyne Joe, eyes sharp, body tense, every muscle attuned to survival. The smell of brine and despair clung to the air, mixing with the bitter fear of those who knew no freedom. Convicts whispered tales of brutality ahead, of punishment that could break even the strongest spirits. Yet Joe's mind wandered, calculating, observing, seeking opportunity. Western Australia appeared as a jagged promise, a land of harsh beauty and deadly wilderness. Its rocky shores and dense forests were a prison and a playground alike. When the ship finally docked, Joe felt the weight of chains and the judgment of officials, but also a flicker of hope. The colony was vast, lawless in parts, yet every corner held the eyes of men who would never forgive and escape. The first steps on the dock were cautious. Joe memorized the guards' routines, the placement of sentries, the angle of shadows at dusk. He watched other prisoners, some broken, some defiant, hearing the whispered stories of the walls that would soon surround him. Every glance at the rising sun reminded him that freedom was fragile and fleeting, but also that a clever mind could bend the rules. By the time he reached the first prison, a looming stone fortress that seemed to devour sound, Joe already plotted. The clanging of heavy doors, the echo of footsteps in empty halls, the bitterness of iron on skin, all of it became fuel for his resolve. He whispered to himself, barely audible, a promise and a warning. No wall is high enough, no guard clever enough to hold me forever. And so begins the legend of Moondyne Joe, a man who would escape, not once, not twice, but again and again, leaving behind tales that would haunt the colony for generations. Life behind the thick stone walls was a calculated torment. Guards followed every routine, counted every step, but Joe saw patterns where they saw obedience. He noticed the gaps between patrols, the corners where shadows swallowed sound, the keys left carelessly in an officer's pocket. Each observation was a spark, a seed of opportunity. One moonless night Joe acted. He moved silently, a shadow among shadows, guided by the faint rhythm of dripping water and distant wind. Every step was measured, every breath a promise of survival. He slipped past the sleeping guards, hearts pounding, muscles taut, feeling the taste of freedom inches away. The wilderness beyond the stone walls was a dangerous friend. Sharp rocks, dense forest, and predators, yet infinitely better than iron and despair. The night was alive with danger. Joe could hear the echo of his own heartbeat mingling with the cries of distant animals. Behind him, guards would soon discover the empty cell, panic spreading like wildfire through the prison. Ahead lay bushland, unfamiliar and merciless, yet he moved with a confidence that would become his hallmark. By dawn, he had vanished from the colony's eyes, leaving only whispers behind. Villagers would later speak of a mysterious figure seen at dusk, moving like a ghost through forests, of tracks that vanished as if the earth itself refused to hold him. Joe had discovered the thrill of being untouchable, the intoxicating taste of liberty earned not through permission but through cunning. From that night, his reputation was born. He became Moondyne Joe, the name carried on wind and water, whispered in fear and awe alike. Each escape would be more daring, each pursuit more desperate, and every jail cell would become a stage for his audacity. The bush became Joe's sanctuary and his battlefield. He moved through its rugged terrain like a shadow, learning its rhythms, its hidden dangers, and its quiet generosity. Streams offered water. Caves provided shelter. Every ridge became an observation post. He adapted quickly, becoming part of the wilderness that the authorities failed to control. Locals began to notice strange signs, footprints that disappeared mid-trail, fires that vanished overnight, glimpses of a man with an iron gaze slipping through the trees. Stories spread, each retelling taller than the last. Some claimed he could disappear into thin air. Others whispered that he carried secrets stolen from the guards themselves. The legend of Moondyne Joe grew, fueled by his skill, daring, and the mystery surrounding him. Yet life as a bushranger was perilous. The government had placed bounties, patrols, and trackers in his path. Every encounter tested his wit and survival instincts. He scavenged, hunted, and sometimes had to fight, but Joe relied more on cunning than brute force. He understood the land as a silent ally, and every misstep by the authorities became an opportunity. At night, under the canopy of stars, he would watch the colony below, fires dotting the landscape like watchful eyes, and smile at his own freedom. But the wilderness taught patience, observation, and humility. Even the cleverest escape artist had to respect its dangers. Joe's legend was no accident. It was the product of sharp instincts, fearless courage, and a mind always plotting the next impossible move. The bushranger life was not just survival, it was performance. Every escape, every disappearance, every narrow evasion became part of a story whispered in towns and forests alike. Moondyne Joe was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of cunning defiance, a shadow that mocked the authority of every prison and lawman in Western Australia. Freedom was intoxicating, but the colony never forgets. Months after his first escape, the authorities finally cornered Joe near a remote riverbank. The trackers had studied his habits, anticipated his moves, and yet Joe's cunning allowed him to survive longer than any expected. When capture came, it was swift but never complete.